welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I read through the letters to the editor in my local newspaper, The West Australian, and I criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First up, a look at shopping, 5th of November 2014. A quick question for all the people wanting more trading hours. Why are Coles and Woolworths putting more and more self-serve machines in their stores? More employment? Methinks not. Stuart McKinlay, Walpole. So the background to this is that for the last several years there's been a big push to increase the regulated trading hours for general retail leading up to Christmas. So there's always a big rush in the shops, particularly on the weekends, for people to get lots of shopping done before Christmas, and not just for presents but also for food. And so there's always this big push to have extended trading. So traditionally we have, say, Sunday trading and extended hours so that people can shop outside of their work time, and presumably get the shopping done so that it's less hectic. The argument behind it all from the employers, well, from the shops, like the large supermarket chains, which here in Western Australia we basically have the two main ones are Coles and Woolworths. Their argument is always that it provides more employment because they'll need to employ people to cover those extra hours. This has been repeatedly shown to basically not be true. What happens is they simply spread their staff over the longer hours, so they have less staff on at other times, as you would expect, because basically extended hours has been shown to not increase actual sales, and therefore you don't have any additional customers coming through. You just have them coming over a wider period of time, and therefore you don't need any more staff. You need the same staff but over wider times. So what happens is that you end up with employees having to work less sociable hours, as it's often referred to. So having to work later into the evenings, earlier in the morning, and on their weekends. Now, the current government has been deregulating shopping hours. I'm not sure how it compares to the rest of the world, but certainly to the rest of Australia, we have quite tightly regulated trading hours here. So it wasn't that long ago that retail was essentially 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, late nights on Thursdays, and a normal trading day on Saturday, and that was it. Very little was allowed to trade on a Sunday in your general retail. And then there were all sorts of exemptions. And so the idea was that we could allow small businesses, so independent stores, to operate outside of these trading hours as a competitive advantage. The thinking being that the large companies would be better placed to drive these smaller companies out of business. And so to sort of offset that market power they have, we could allow them to trade on weekends, Sundays, late nights, things like that. And that was the general approach that was taken for probably more than a decade now. Probably actually more like 20 years or so. That's been undone a lot, and we're now getting to the point where there's a push on to have 24-hour trading, essentially to have a deregulated market so that stores can set their own times to open and close, which sounds like a reasonable thing from somebody who values freedom and choice. The problem being that the psychology of shoppers here, at least, and in general, is that most shoppers prefer to shop at the same place. There is an advantage to being able to open at all hours, because then the shopper always knows you're open, and so people will get into the patterns of going to those 24-hour stores. The bigger chains have much more ability to do that than the smaller shops. So although you would say to the smaller shops, look, if you can't afford to open in the middle of the night because there's no customers, then don't bother doing it. That's fine. It won't cost you anything. Except, of course, it will, because once people are in the habit of it only takes one or two times for somebody to need emergency run out of milk and go, it's 10 o'clock at night, I wonder what's going to be open. Should I bother going to the local place that might not be open, or go to the large store that I know will definitely be open because it's open 24 hours? So that reliability, being able to reliably know that they will be open, means that people are more likely to go there. And you'll see, over and above the market power that the large chains use to crush the smaller competition, you'll see additional effects driving towards it. Now, in the end, it's not going to be too bad for consumers. It'll actually be fine, because we've got another couple of large chains coming into the state fairly soon. The main one being Aldi, and they will, place plenty of competition so that consumers in the end will be okay. What we do value here, though, is smaller independent business owners and suppliers in particular. So we know that when we've got a relatively few number of retail outlets with market power, so here Coles and Woolworths, they have an inordinate amount of power over the suppliers. So they can put a lot of pressure on suppliers simply by refusing to give them shelf space is the threat. We've seen that happen exceedingly here. So what's happened is that supermarket shelves are almost entirely filled with own brand stuff now, as they've squeezed out all the independent suppliers. The own brand stuff is made under the regulate or under the control of the large supermarkets, and they can dictate conditions. And we simply are not a large enough economy here, certainly here in the West, where we're in the middle of nowhere, for that sort of that model of a sort of an open market that is competitive actually works. It simply isn't big enough to support that. So what we see is a lot of anti-competitive behaviour happening. Now, I think in the long run, we're not going to do away with that simply by having another couple of supermarket chains moving in, and we'll never have I don't think we'll have the enough population to offset the isolation of us here. And so I think actually it was a sensible move up until recently to support small businesses and independent players as a way of encouraging competition by giving them competitive advantage to offset the disadvantage that they're experiencing. But that's not the way it's going. So yeah, self-serve machines, of course, is the way of the future. Everybody's got them now. There's a big push to them. New supermarkets are opening, are almost entirely self-serve with one or two checkouts. The old supermarkets that haven't been able to convert yet just have empty checkouts for most of the day. Self-serve is definitely the way to go. And so yes, for them to argue that somehow employment is going to, they're going to be employing more people when the drive actually is for supermarket efficiency to go up, that is, they're actually able to do with less and less people for the same hour and even more hours, is just a lie on their part. It is just, yeah, it's spin. Blink and you'll miss it. 6th of November 2014. With advertising billboards scheduled for Mitchell Freeway, I told the Minister that Perth has some of the world's worst drivers and that by giving them a distraction would only add to danger on the freeway. Advertising in road reserves, the Minister replied, will not cause driver distraction. That of course begs the question, why then are they installing billboards if they know for a fact that no one will even look at them? Neil Parsons Clarkson. Okay, so firstly, I doubt that Perth really has some of the world's worst drivers. We like to think that, and we are not the big city that we like to think we are, even though we have a population that is disproportionate. That is, we have more population than the size of our city would seem to imply. There are plenty of much smaller cities around the world that seem bigger than ours due to things like population density. And so drivers here are not great, but they're probably on par with anywhere else. And they certainly aren't within the world's worst. We generally obey the road rules in a way that, plenty of countries don't. We're probably, we are the kinds of drivers that you get when people are not used to driving in traffic, is basically what we are. Now, what's happened is there's been a push recently to have large billboards put up along some of our freeways. And this is a fairly big deal. Billboards are actually very rare here. I'm not sure if this is a trend across the world or whether it's just us being weird, but we just really don't have very many billboards. They don't generally get approved by the local council. People don't like them in the area, and so they don't have them. In sort of relatively commercial areas, you get more of them, but anywhere where you have local residences, you just don't get them. And so there's a push to have some billboards put up along the freeway, which is sort of not going to impinge on local house values. And I think there's some flash, electronic ones so that they can cycle the ads or something like that. And of course, there's been this big outcry from people saying that, well, surely this is going to distract drivers. And the governor said, no, it won't. And there's been lots of letters back and forth in the paper. But the thing that most people miss is that there is a difference, and I'm not sure whether this is actually applicable in this sense, because I haven't actually found any good data on it, but there is a difference between being distracted and noticing an advertising. So it is quite possible, in a theoretical sense, and I'm aware of some research, psychological research that is sort of tangentially related, that it is possible to notice things without them distracting you. It's quite possible to notice things without realising that you've noticed them. There's a lot that we do when we're driving that we don't actually notice we're doing, but we still do it. And I would argue that this is quite possible in this case. it is quite possible to have ads that are distracting. And there have been cases around the world where particularly distracting ads on billboards have led to a spike in traffic accidents around them. And so that is quite possible, but I don't think it's a necessary link. I think it is, at least in theory, possible to have advertising that is not distracting while still being noticeable. Now, there's also the possibility that it's actually aiming at passengers in the car and things like that, but our driving habits here essentially is one person to a car, so that's probably not the market they're going for. And everybody seems to miss that. Nobody's actually argued a point over that in all the letters I've been writing in. So, as far as I can see, it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you've got billboards means you're going to have distracted drivers. The death toll, 7th of November 2014. I agree with Terence Sullivan, Examine the Reality, Letters 6th to 11th, regarding the overreaction to the unfortunate death of 2 Melbourne Cup runners. Admire Rakti died from what has been reported as heart failure, and the other horse, Araldo, was euthanised because of a broken leg caused by someone waving a flag in front of the animal and spooking it. So what data has Barbara Jordan, A Fatal Sport, Letters 6th to 11th, researched to say that thousands of horses are slaughtered each year in racing? Colin Hogg, Boddington. So the Melbourne Cup is a big deal in Australia, particularly in Melbourne, but also the rest of Australia, which is a horse race. Many people take the day off, bet on the horses, get very drunk, and generally make a fool of themselves. And this year, 2 horses died during the event, or shortly thereafter, which is somewhat unusual. It's rare that a horse dies, let alone 2, during this event. And that led to a lot of people sort of saying, well, isn't this barbaric, that we still have these kind of incidents like this? And it's particularly galling when you have all these people who are dolled up and frocked up and having a great time and drinking, and the horse sort of stumbles or whatever, and then they have to bring out the shields out around it, and then it gets shot, and then it gets carted off in the back of the knacker's wagon, or equivalent. It is a particularly strange juxtaposition when we think of ourselves as these sophisticated people who are, betting on horses, and then you have something that seems kind of barbaric like that. And all for our entertainment. These horses are not serving a crucial part of our life. They're not even food. You could argue about the merits of vegetarianism, but this is even one step removed from that. This is purely entertainment purposes, and these horses died. Now, as this person points out, people have said that there are thousands of horses that are slaughtered each year due to racing. Well, what's the data? Well, actually, the data is really straightforward. There are approximately, in Australia, about 15,000 thoroughbred horses are bred each year, or I'm not quite sure what the technical term is, for racing. So there's about 15,000 a year that are bred. Assuming some kind of equilibrium, which seems to be the case, the industry isn't growing or falling by any huge amount, that means that for the industry to remain sort of relatively static, about 15,000 a year die. Now, I looked into this, and basically that 15,000 a year that leave racing, a very small number of them will go on to be people's pets or things like this, or find other employment, as it were. The vast majority of them, 10,000 at least, a year leave the industry by being killed. There's literally a dozen or so horses, a couple of dozen at most, racehorses that are put out to stud. There's a whole breeding population of about 30,000 racehorses thoroughbreds out there for breeding. And so the ones who are actually racing very rarely get put out to stud. And so there's about 15,000 horses a year entering the thoroughbred racing industry. There's about at least 10,000 of them are being put down, and they are ending up as pet meat. And that is basically it. There is no way around the figures. These are thousands and thousands of horses we're talking about. Now, most of those won't have even raced once. Some of them will have trained and been found to be not up to scratch, and will simply have been taken off for slaughter. In fact, it's not even slaughter. We have 2 abattoirs in the whole of Australia that do horse meat slaughter for the overseas market, because nobody in Australia eats it. And the rest of it isn't even called slaughtering, the so-called knackers yards that take them for pet meat. That's what the vast bulk of those 10,000 horses a year go on for pet meat. And many of those, as I say, have never raced and will never race. May well have had some training, at which point realise that they're never going to be a champion, they're never going to win any money, and they get shipped off to Knacker's Yard. I was completely unaware of this. I didn't realise the numbers were quite that bad. I always assumed that that the industry comprised mainly of race horses, but it doesn't actually. It has a huge pool of talent from which it draws a relatively small number of horses that actually race. And the talent is basically just bred and turned into cat food. So actually, it was kind of appalling to find this out. And the deaths on track, the official figures are somewhere around roughly one horse dying in the actual act of racing for every 1,000 starts, which by my rough calculations is about 4 or 5 a year here in Australia for thoroughbred racing. Harness racing is about half that. So it means that, yeah, relatively few horses, although there are a whole pile of health complaints that come from racing. Essentially, these are like what happens to elite athletes if you had no ethics in terms of your duty of care to them. So if we could push our elite athletes as far as we possibly could to get the ultimate performance out of them for, even if it was for the shortest bit of time, that's what we do with these horses. So whereas in the NFL you've had concern over concussions and things, and there's been some steps taken to address it, and there is some sense that you can't just grind these people up under unrelenting sort of football schedule and then spit them out the other end, although in practice that's what's happened. With horses, it's even worse because they don't stand up for their rights, because they don't have any rights and they're not sentient or whatever. And so actually what we do is, in the industry, the ones who are racing are pushed to their absolute limits. The number of races, the average number of races that a horse that actually races will actually do in their career has dropped dramatically since about the 1970s. So back then it was about 10. On average, a horse would race 10 races before being retired for whatever reason, because it was just unfit or too old or because it had an injury. That's down to something like 3 or 4 at the moment. So at the moment, on average, horses are racing only 3 or 4 races for their entire career. So champion horses might do 10 or 12. Lots and lots of other horses are doing 1 or 2 and then becoming injured or just aren't up to the peak, or they sustain some kind of health issue because they've been pushed so far, they get little cracks on their bones or things like that, and they become lame, or they can't walk properly, or they bleed from the lungs, and then they can't race anymore, and they are sent off to the cat food factory. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't. I'm not mounting a moral argument at this point that we shouldn't necessarily use animals for our entertainment. I think that's a deeper issue that I don't have the arguments to hand. But I do think that it is disingenuous for people who support the horse racing industry to suggest that somehow the bulk of racehorses get to race and enjoy racing, because that's simply not the truth. And to suggest that it's mere tens of horses or hundreds of horses that are slaughtered each year is also completely not the case. It's 10,000 in a country like Australia, which is a shocking amount given. Well, certainly it was shocking to me. I suspect it was shocking to most people. Next up, it all cost money. 8th of November 2014. Where do I sign for free medical cover? Mine currently costs roughly $3,500 a year, not including the private cover I am forced to have, or pay more tax for my free Medicare cover. And where does my wife go to get her free Kate Blanchett degree? Under the current system, she will have a higher education contribution scheme debt of around $60,000. When will lefties understand there is no such thing as free? Somebody always has to pay. Dean May, Kalamunda. Yes, lefties do understand that. When they talk about having free education, what they generally mean is it is free to the student, that the rest of society, in general, through taxation, picks up the tab. With the expectation, certainly, that most people who receive university degrees, you would expect to go on and have jobs afterwards that earn a reasonable amount of money, and they would then pay taxes to pay for the next crop. So no, I don't think, there can't be that many people who honestly think that there is just free education that can be thrown at people. It has to be paid for somewhere. The whole point is that it's somewhat unfair to expect the students to be the ones who need to pay for it up front. Now, you mentioned higher education contribution scheme. And yes, that is a debt, but that is not a loan debt in the same way that other countries have. That $60,000 you owe does not have any interest associated with it. It increases only at inflation levels, so it maintains its current value. And you only repay it as part of taxation when your income reaches a certain threshold. And after that, you repay small amounts of it pegged to your income threshold, because it's the government, they do it through income tax. So essentially it means that if you don't get a job, or you only ever earn small amounts of money after your degree, you don't actually pay it back. So the system is set up so that those people who then become wealthy through high-paying degrees pay off their debt. This is precisely, the sort of relatively fair system whereby those who are most able to pay do so, and those who are least able to pay don't. I don't think there's anything particularly in that is particularly egregious, except perhaps the debt amounts. It might be better to shift that to general taxation rather than specific people. But other than that, it's not a bad idea. Now, you're right on Medicare, that Medicare had this idea of being free universal healthcare, and it isn't. What's happened is that's been scaled back a lot. And those people on the left have fought against that for a very long time. And most of the successes in the things they've fought for has been to make sure that it is free to those who need it the most. So even as there has been this assault from the right to make individuals pay more for their own healthcare rather than spreading the burden across the society so that it comes from taxation on things like companies and royalties from digging iron ore out of the ground, the right has tried to shift that back onto individual user pays system, which is the complete antithesis of a community or society taking responsibility for things. The left have fought that. And yes, you have probably ended up in a situation where you have to have private health cover, or you face an additional levy, which basically means that you end up paying about the same. Either way, I'm in exactly the same situation. We as a household earn enough that essentially I have to have private health insurance. And while that might seem like somewhat of an impost, it's on us because we earn above a certain amount. This is part of what allows those people who are most vulnerable and most poor in the community to have pretty much free health cover. And so, no, you can't sign up for free health cover except by the method that everybody else does, which if you, through a unfortunate series of events, ends up particularly poorly off and can't afford healthcare anymore, that the society will pick up the tab for you, as it should. So yeah, somebody has to pay, but in most fair societies we try and encourage it to be those who are most able to be, rather than putting it on those least able to pay. Last up, what's changed? 11th of November 2014. There has been much discussion about the many varieties of available drugs and the amount of alcohol consumed. But powers that be are reluctant to ponder why, 50 years ago, we didn't have this mess. In those days, the minimum drinking age was 21, pubs closed at 9 p.m, drugs were almost non-existent, and there was respect for the law, teachers, parents, and most importantly, oneself. Now look around and make sense of this Maya. Mario Rapinaro Dianella. Now, just out of interest, I thought, well, let's look back 50 years and see what's going on. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any good contemporaneous sources from Western Australia, so I can't quite talk about that context. But in 1964, which was 50 years ago, interestingly, one of WA's most notorious serial killers, Edgar Cook, was executed. He's the last man in WA to be executed. He was a notorious serial killer who terrorised Perth in the sort of early 1960s. So he was doing that at the time. I'm not quite sure what his respect for the law was, teachers or parents. We had the Moors murderers in the UK. They were active at that point, kidnapping and killing and even occasionally raping their victims. In the US, we had race riots. The Ku Klux Klan was still lynching people. There were civil rights activists who were disappearing and being murdered by the Klan 50 years ago. Also in 1964, Kitty Genovese was murdered in New York. Now, this is a particularly infamous case where this woman was stabbed a few times while trying to get to her apartment block in New York City. The murderer left and came back half an hour later and stabbed her a few more times to ensure the job was done, and raped her and ended up killing her. Now, there were some issues around the way it was reported, but people were aware that she was being stabbed and did very little. There's some disagreement over exactly how that played out, but it led to a lot of the research on bystander effect, where people see things happening and don't do anything in response. So there was another famous case of murder in 1964. Now, what I suspect is, yes, there were far less drug-related offences back then. I'm not sure about alcohol. I suspect that back then, at least at some point a while back, alcohol wasn't really seen as a thing, even though everybody drank it for much of the time. So certainly certainly in the 20s and 30s, there were people who would drink all day, every day. Maybe not in huge quantities, but certainly alcohol was always there, and it wasn't seen through our modern eyes as being something that affects you and changes the way you behave. And so certainly a lot of those times, if these people were drinking, or if people were drinking and causing problems, it wasn't necessarily reported as such or remembered as such. And the other thing is that we know that society now, certainly in Western Australia, is safer than it ever has been, and certainly back in 1964. So you were more likely to be raped, murdered, killed, or assaulted back in 1964 than you are now. So what this tells us is that, at best, you've got this argument that crime has shifted over the last 50 years. So where we now have more drug-fueled crime that we didn't have before. But at the same time, we've actually had a reduction in crime rate. So the thing is, we're still safer overall. And back then, people did these horrible things still. We didn't blame it on drugs, because they weren't taking drugs. We generally didn't blame it on alcohol either, because we didn't see alcohol as being particularly causative. And I suspect there's always been a stand-in kind of archetype of the person to blame for heinous behaviour in society. The person who is irrational, who is immoral, who will just do the horrible things that their heart desires that you can do nothing about. And at the moment, it's the drug-fueled crazies. It's the people who are high on meth. I think in the 80s it was definitely PCP. They used to talk about people on PCP just having the superhuman strength, and you could put 6 bullets in them and they wouldn't stop. And that was definitely drug-related, and I think to a lesser extent crack cocaine. Certainly much further back in our history, we used to look at mentally ill people that way. We used to have the archetype of the lunatic, the person who just had, the Jekyll and Hyde type lunatic, that they were just so mad, they had insane strength, they couldn't be reasoned with, and yeah, again, they could take a beating and they could keep walking because they were mad in the head. Young black men often feel this stereotype as well, of this vision of young black men being so muscular and hyper-masculine that they can't be stopped. And so I suspect that all societies have had this kind of scapegoat, this kind of boogeyman, or bogeyman, if you like, who is the person to be afraid of, that they cannot be argued with, cannot be reasoned with, cannot be defended against, who act out these violent sort of tendencies with no thought to the consequences to themselves or others. And at the moment it's just, drugs is the thing. And like all stereotypes, it has a grain of truth, but like all stereotypes, it's mostly bullshit. Anyway, there you go, that's it for this week. Hope you're all doing well. I'm feeling much better having had a rant, and I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.